Hello? I'm not sure if finish live. Am I audible? Tsele, please tell me if you can hear me. Hello? Tsele. Just write down there to indicate if I'm audible. I don't want to go yada yada here only to find that I'm not audible. Can you hear me, Tsele? Oh, thank you. Okay. This is not the best of arrangements. I'll try to make the best out of it. I've been asked by some young comrades to speak on COVID-19 and the terminal crisis of global capitalism. The topic is decidedly formulated as such: COVID-19 and the terminal crisis of global capitalism. The topic has been formulated as such because COVID-19 found capitalism in a crisis already, a crisis that is terminal, a crisis in which capitalism has no way out. But what it has done is to accentuate, to bring to the fore the main elements of the systematic crisis of capitalism. So we will try and discuss that. The current crisis of capitalism comes a long way. It's a crisis that started in the mid-70s, 1975, when the post-war boom, which most economists call the golden age, came to an end. For the longest time after the Second World War, Keynesians thought that they could control the demand, the aggregate demand in the economy by spending more when the economy is down and reducing government spending when the economy is up. They did that for some time after the Second World War, and when that boom got exhausted, Keynesian mechanisms of stimulating the economy no longer work. They had to find other ways within the framework of capitalism to stimulate the economy. That boom had been preceded by another longest crisis of capitalism that lasted for 25 years. A crisis that started with the First World War and ended with the Second World War. First World War in 1914, the end of the Second World War was 1945. And in between those two wars, there was a deep depression, or Great Depression, where the accumulation, the capital accumulation collapsed. Industrial production collapsed up to 50% in the US. unemployment was sometimes 33% in the US during the Depression. The Depression lasted from 1929 until the end of the Second World War. So the end of the Second World War created an opportunity to rebuild capitalism anew, because what the World War did was to destroy the infrastructure, was to destroy everything. So capitalism took that opportunity of the reconstruction effort following the destruction of the war to rebuild itself. And the state was key, because the private sector would have been destroyed by the war. So the state was key in building industries after the Second World War. Even Fiat, this motor vehicle, Italy, was one state-owned. So nationalization after the Second World War in the North was like a very fashionable thing. Social wage was expanded. People were given free housing, free electricity, free education, and so on, and guaranteed jobs. In the US, wages were very high in that period from 1945 until 1975. Now, every other boom can last so far and no further. So the post-war boom came to an end in the 70s. The economy landed into a crisis. Others call it was a stagnation plus inflation, stagflation. Some mainstream economists, they call it that. Other clever economists who are linked to Marxism in its various schools, they say actually it was a crisis of accumulation, because that cycle, industrial cycle, had exhausted itself, you know. So capitalism in the global North entered into that crisis. Now, in order to restructure in the 70s, unlike after the Second World War, in order to restructure, because a lot had collapsed. I mean, even the Bretton Woods financial system that had been installed after the Second World War, where the dollar and the gold standard were linked, and all currencies of major countries in the world were fixed to the dollar. So when the economy tumbled, so these economies, all of them, experience balance of payments problems in their international accounts. So they had to switch off from the dollar, fixing their currencies on the dollar. So even Nixon, am I still there? This thing is so lonely. So even Nixon, who was president of the US at the time, he ended the gold dollar standard. The dollar now was to operate as the reserve currency of the world without gold as a standard. So instead of reviving industrial production that had collapsed in the West, capital shifted industrial production to the global South, particularly China and Asia. So industrial production was shifted to the global South, and the structure of capitalist economies in the North was now mainly dominated by services and other secondary industries, tertiary and secondary industries, or rather tertiary industries, because even manufacturing, which would be the heartbeat of industrial production, was shifted to the global south, China in particular, because there was cheap labor there and large economies of scale, so they could produce more for less. But then finance was also liberalized. Capital was also globalized, and the state, more than at any other time, was now subjected to the rule of capital, almost colonialization of the state. So it was the introduction of the neoliberal era. That's the 70s. Coming this way, into the 80s, 90s, neoliberalism has been building itself. We talk about the crisis of capitalism that is terminal, because unlike most bourgeois thinkers, bourgeois historians and bourgeois economists, capitalism is not a permanent social system. It is a historically transitory system. It's not an old system. Industrial capitalism as we have it today, only triumphed or crystallized in 1800, That's like 200 years ago, 220 years ago. That's not a long time ago. Before that, that was just after the Industrial Revolution of the steam engine. So before that, you had mercantile capitalism, which would have started in the 15th century, mainly dominated by agriculture. And the earlier efforts to build capitalism would have started in the Italian cities in 14th century. So the deepening crisis of capitalism is proving that capitalism is indeed a historically limited system, because it is not viable, as Karl Marx showed that its endless accumulation is unviable. Capitalism is a system that is predicated on producing for profits, and these profits should grow all the time. So that's growth. It is predicated on growth. Now, that's not viable, So which is why Karl Marx, in his intensive research, proved that capitalism always suffer from a problem of overproduction, because people will not buy stuff all the time. They get enough with stuff. And when they get enough with stuff, they hold back in buying. When they hold back, then the economy lands into a recession, because people are not buying. When the economy lands into a recession, capitalists then cut back on the stock. They also retrench workers. They cut back even on their capital. So the economy contracts. So Karl Marx was the first to lay this to bear, that capitalism has this problem of recurrent crisis. It has industrial cycles, So he's the one who invented the famous business cycle in economics. But then it's not like this business cycle happens like mainstream economists think, that every business cycle will just find a runaway industries, revive the economy and rebuild anew, and nothing happens, and so accumulation continues. No. Depending on the severity of the crisis, for instance, in the 70s, what you had there was a very serious crisis, such that the rates of growth of the economy, capitalist economy in the core countries, the average rate was very low in the 80s and 90s. It hit its first financial recession in 1989, another one in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, and then the severe one in 2008. Uh, so we can see right before our eyes that capitalism is not sustainable. It's not just a national system, it's a global system where countries of the north accumulate by dispossessing countries of the south. Imperialism is inherent in the logic of capitalism. It's not the higher stage, as Lenin said. No, because capitalism always suffer from the problem of realizing surplus value within the context of national capitalism. Then they look for markets in faraway countries where there's cheap labor, where they can dominate governments and loot resources. So we can go back in the 18th century, coming this way before this and after the Second World War, up until the victory against colonialism by liberation movements. We can see that capitalism actually depended largely on countries of global south in order to survive. So it has that polarization. Now, 2008 was the greatest capitalist crisis since the Great Depression of 1929. Now, the capitalist economies had not recovered from the crisis of 2008. If you look at the data before the corona, you will see that all these major countries were about to enter recession. In fact, the growth levels that they had reached after 2009, they did not surpass. They were still below the growth levels pre 2008 recession. So it was a crisis that was not going away. But then the capitalist crisis is not just economic. It's economic, it's ecological, it's social, it's political. I'm going to take you through those elements of the crisis in my presentation here today. I hope you follow. So COVID has accentuated the crisis of capitalism in all of these dimensions. In the ecology, it's a biological, medical crisis. In the economy, the accumulation crisis that I've just spoken about. In politics, management of societies, you have Trump in what they say is a biggest democracy in the world. Trump is worse than Zuma. Trump is worse than anything we can imagine. Trump, when he was campaigning, he said he was in a town hall. He said, I can shoot a person now and still be elected president. So that's how dumb the man is. And then he won. Now they say, no, he did not get the popular vote. But that's the system of the US. It has that college thing where people can just veto and override what the popular vote is saying. So he won. And that's the system of the US. So I'll also go to the politics, the crisis of politics and how it finds manifestation during the COVID. I'll talk about social as well, the crisis of social reproduction, capitalism failing to enable people to earn the bare minimum through which they could live. Capitalism threatening the groups that are already threatened, the unemployed, black people everywhere, women, the poor working classes, the poor popular classes. They are worse off now with COVID and the lockdowns. Now, let's talk about the ecological crisis, and then I will conclude with way forward. So I'm going to talk about those four things: ecological crisis and COVID, economic crisis and COVID, political crisis and COVID, social crisis and COVID, then way forward. So the crisis of ecology, how does it manifest itself? The crisis of ecology manifests itself through the accumulation system that is endless, that promote endless consumption and therefore depleting natural resources. And not only that, it also destroys ecosystems. You know, all these ecosystems you can think of. The plants, the animals, the climate. Climate is the biggest of these crises. You know, in 2018, the United Nations released a report around October in which they showed that climate is becoming a serious crisis that is going to affect weather patterns, threaten food production, rising sea levels, and the risk of catastrophic floods, you know. So drastic measures are needed to avert global warming and the impact of climate change. That's what that report said. Then it went on to say, instead of earlier targets of reducing, of making sure that temperature does not increase by to 2 degrees Celsius pre-industrial level. You know, instead of 2 degrees Celsius, the United Nations was saying, no, 2 degrees is way too dangerous. We're currently at 1 degree above the pre-industrial level. That report said, no, actually we need to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You know, because already even now with this 1 degree increase by 1 degree above the pre-industrial level, we can already see serious environmental damages coming out of climate change, the weather, you know, floods. Even here in South Africa, in Durban, or KZN the other year, was it last year? I mean, in north of our country here, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, I mean, they had catastrophic floods the other time. We had a problem of water in Cape Town, you know. So we had a problem of drought actually for the longest time in South Africa. So United Nations was saying drastic measures are now required. Drastic measures not just to replace fossil fuels by non-fossil fuels energies, no, but drastic measures in the entire society, in the entire economy are required, you know. So that was the United Nations. Actually, what they were saying even surpasses what all these other, what do they call these agreements, the Kyotos and Paris recently, and there was Madrid that did not make any agreement. Paris, before this report, had spoken about limiting the temperature to 2 degrees above the industrial level. But this report was saying, no. We are going to die if we get there. And it said we only have 10 years from now until 2030 to do all of these things. And by 2050, we must net zero by 2050, more drastic measures must have been achieved in terms of lowering global emissions. So it's either this or the planet is going to be extinct. So these people who like saying, no, capitalism always adapt from crises. No, they're not telling the truth. Capitalism has never had an ecological crisis that it faces now, you know. And COVID exactly manifests itself in that space as well, in that it is a system in the biodiversity, you know. They say COVID is caused by a newly evolved virus that is called SARS-CoV-2. I'll tell you in a minute what does that SARS-CoV-2 stand for. It is caused by that virus. And they say this SARS-CoV-2 belongs to the family. It's a coronavirus. It belongs to the family of coronaviruses. These coronaviruses, actually, they say they've been around since the 60s or so. And I read somewhere in a blog by Sam William that they are called like this because an electron microscope, under an electron microscope, they appear as a ball-like objects covered by spikes resembling crowns. Viruses in this family use the crowns to inject their genetic material into the whole cell. The various genetic code then instruct the infected cell to produce more various particles. So that's why they call them corona. And then they say again, they say this coronavirus is very harmful and more dangerous than other coronavirus before it, you know. So, which is why to date it has infected more than 5 million people. It has killed more than 325,000 people in the whole world. US is leading. You know, US, when this corona crisis broke out, one thing I forgot to mention about neoliberalism earlier is that in the 70s, when they implemented neoliberalism, one of the things they did was to extend the market to public goods. So, because they were liberalizing the markets, they were liberalizing finance, they were liberalizing everything. You know, if they were in the township, now, so when they were busy doing that, they then cut back on spending in health, you know. Now, America is the richest country in world history, but they don't have ventilators, you know. They have all the money in the world. Money than the wealth that is far more bigger than any other country has ever had in modern history. They say so. The richest country, they don't have ventilators. Whereas they don't have protective clothing. The masks, they didn't have them when this virus broke out. The richest country in the world. Now, that's how upset capitalism is. So it's because these countries, they held back on spending in health, in education, workers' wages went down, you know, so that's why they die more now during Corona. So, neoliberalism now is coming back to bite them in the West. The same with Britain. Britain, after the Second World War, they were the first to implement the NHI, National Health System. They call it NHS there. They were the first. They were the first to put everybody there on that universal coverage. But since Thatcher's time in the 70s, Thatcher and Reagan were the ones who were leading the charge in this policy of neoliberalism, where the state was cutting back, where the private sector was given more authority, in the economy and in the social space, So the state was like colonized by finance capital. Now, that's why it has hit these countries of the North this much. I mean, even recently, during the 2009 crisis, in Europe, when there was a crisis, there was a paper that was written by some economists of Harvard who said, no, actually, instead of government spending more, you need less expenditure by government. During recession, you need austerity. Now, austerity in a recession is madness. Madness, because the private sector is down and out. It can't spend, so somebody has to spend to stimulate the economy. But those clever economists of Harvard wrote that paper. Then, typical, in public policy, when they are to implement these reactionary policies, they must cite some experts. So these experts from Harvard were cited by the European Union that these are the measures that are required. And those are the measures that have plunged Europe into this crisis. Because already, neoliberalism had curtailed spending on social services. Now, European Union insisted on more austerity. Now, these countries that were affected more, what did they call them? Pigs. It was Spain. What does P stand for? Spain, Italy, Greece. I can't remember the other one. But those countries that were affected more, they implemented the severest of these austerities, not a long time ago, 10 years ago. So Italy was one of the pig countries. Now, they are suffering. They are bearing the brunt of their own neoliberal medicine. Now, in the US, because the US hegemon is Portugal. Yes, thank you, Pat. It was the P stands for it was Portugal as well. It was one of the pigs. Now in the US, when this corona broke out, because the economy is so important to them, accumulation that is endless is so important. They did not heed advice from experts to close down the economy. They said, no, we'll politicize it. They said, no, it's a Trump said, no, it's a China virus. They went further. There's this guy who used to be head of CIA. He works now with Trump. He's the one who actually said, no, this thing was started in the laboratories in China. It was done deliberately to sabotage the US. But at least that guy, Anthony Fauci, their leading expert in fighting coronavirus, said, no, that's nonsense. All the scientific evidence shows that this virus evolved in nature and jumped into species. They talk about birds there and human beings, and so you'll not know what really happened. There's no conclusive evidence as to where does this coronavirus come from. It was first discovered in China, in Wuhan. In that city where it was discovered, they do large-scale animal industrial agriculture, and it involves a lot of deforestation and so on. So there's a lot of interface with birds, the human beings now undermining nature. That's what this whole ecological crisis is brought about. You know, we don't want to leave nature to be on its own. Vishwas, the other day, wrote a beautiful article. He said nature is fighting back with this virus, you know, because capitalism makes the human being to think they can conquer all. No, we have to coexist with all of these ecosystems. If we destroy these ecosystems, human life will be extinct from the face of the earth. Now, you can say it's from China, but others who have studied these things, they say, no, actually, there's what is called circuits of capital. How capital circulate in global markets. Now, there are big American companies that have large investment in agricultural companies there in Wuhan, you know. So, we don't know. But then, industrial agriculture is also a problem. Large-scale industrial agriculture is a big problem. They don't give us healthy food. That's why Rob Wallace has written a book with a title that says, Big Farms Make Big Flu. That's true. You see, if they say you don't have to read a book by its cover, that one, it just says that. And we know it's true. I've ordered the book. I hope to receive it from my bookseller soon. Rob Wallace and his colleagues wrote a very, very beautiful article in the monthly review that I recommend that all comrades and all friends read it. You know, they trace and analyze this crisis in biodiversity, you know, and they say actually the crisis is such that pandemics are going to be with us from time to time, you know. So that's a crisis of capitalism. It is bringing us pandemics. And with all the available resources that are there, we don't have face masks. We don't have them. They must be manufactured. We don't have them enough, you know. We don't have protective clothes, you know. We don't have ventilators. You know, there's a report that came out yesterday night. I'll talk about it later. So with all the advances in science and technology, we are being killed by flus. That's just how absurd capitalism is, you know. So they say these pandemics are going to be a common recurrence. And it's difficult for scientists to work out vaccines because they take long. By the time we get a vaccine, we are all dead. But here's another thing. These viruses, by their very own nature, they mutate. They develop different strains in a very short space of time. That's why the flu, you can get flu every year. Despite the fact that last year you took a vaccine, you will still get it next year again. That vaccine last year will not help you to protect you from a flu next year because a new strain will come and hit you. But now, we are being hit by deadly flus. That's how the biodiversity has been destroyed. And despite all the resources that are there, we are still not safe. Now, in South Africa, most of the time, since March, the virus was confined in middle classes and then and upper classes in the suburbs. So for a while, popular classes in the township and in informal settlements were spared from the virus. It seems the lockdown has somehow delayed the spillover of the virus to the working classes, at least for some time. It has bought us some time. But that is changing now, because I heard Makura the other day mentioning some townships of Gauteng to say they are now hotspots. Already, Guguletu, Nyanga, and other townships in the Western Cape have become hotspots of the virus. I earlier thought that if the virus hit the townships and informal settlement, it would have got itself a fertile ground, and it would spread like wildlife. I hope I'm wrong, because it will really kill our people. It will kill us in a very big way, like it is doing in the US, even worse. So I said that, I had that observation because townships and informal settlements are obviously densely populated, and there's high levels of underdevelopment, and there's no proper access to healthcare, to sanitation. There's just nothing, you know. So if it gets there, it will get a fertile ground. Actually, if you don't believe me, just follow what is happening in Brazil. For the longest time, Brazil did not feature prominently in the coronavirus, but now it has overtaken even the United Kingdom as the third or fourth, I think it's the third country that has more deaths. You know, in terms of cases, I think it is number 4. So coronavirus is coming to the global south. And if you just look on TV, you will see Brazil has many slums, you know, townships that are densely populated. Now, there's a report. I've not been following news last night and today, but I saw on News 24, it is reported that some team of experts reported to the minister and whoever the power that be, that by September, our corona is going to reach its peak. And by that time, it will kill 40,000 people, and in fact, more than 1 million people. And they actually say our current bed capacity, ICU bed capacity, is way too low. It must be augmented 10 times. They say we have like, I don't know, 4,000 beds, and we need, 40,000. That's how bad our situation is. And the other day, when Cyril was speaking on TV, saying there are 25 beds for quarantine, I asked the question, why is he talking about 25 beds for quarantine? What about hospital beds? Now, this report of experts, they are talking exactly that. So we were told earlier by government that we need a lockdown so that we delay the rate of infection, so that in the meantime we ready the health system. So Cyril did not go to TV to tell us, to say, no, in the time since the lockdown, we have gotten so much nurses in our hospitals so that we've increased our staff by this much, so that when the corona hits the peak, we are ready. We've increased the number of our beds by this much. He didn't tell us that. So that when people get sick, can be admitted. We've procured so much ventilators, No, he didn't, Instead, he was a mess. He even compared us to countries where corona is behaving differently, to countries that have high levels of corona. So I think government has not been handling this thing very well. I don't want to talk about schools. I could not watch TV last night. My daughter misplaced the remote control. And when we switch on the TV was on silent. She has been dominating the TV throughout the corona period. So by the time we switch on, the minister was finished talking. And I've seen many people are complaining. Schools are always going to be difficult. So let's hope they'll manage it better. But I think what will work is local approaches, schools. I was in a Zoom meeting in my school, my child's school. my boy is doing matric. So I could hear that at least the principal and the school management, they are in control. So let's hope that all the schools and even district departments of education will help schools to manage this thing better, because I think it will be better if you do it that way, in communities there. Work with communities as well, and this thing of bringing soldiers that doesn't help, because this is a health crisis. We're not fighting an invading enemy. We're fighting a virus. Soldiers will not help us. There's no amount of soldiers that is going to help us. So I hope they'll handle it better. Now I'm going to rush other parts because I've taken a lot of time on COVID and the ecological crisis. I'm going to rush through the economic crisis. I had touched on it already. I'll just highlight points that I didn't highlight. I go to political, social, and then conclude with a way forward. When I speak in conferences, I speak for 20 minutes. But now here on Facebook, these comrades did not tell me how much time do I have to speak. So I then felt, no, if they don't give me time, I should expropriate this time without compensation. Talk forever. No, I'm joking, I'll not. Now, the economic crisis, like I said, capitalism has an accumulation crisis. It always produces more than people can buy, So for some time, they use all these sorts of methods to avert a crisis. They lower interest rates, they do that, now. But then crisis still hit them. And when it does, it hit them hard. So like it did with the Great Recession of 2008, and the 2008 crisis, it's a crisis that is not going away. The Great Recession, the post-Great Recession period, in the post-Great Recession period, capital struggled to find profitable outlets for their investments. Because capitalists, isn't it, that they always look to invest so that they can make more profits. And out of those profits, they will invest again so that they make more profits. Out of those profits, they go on doing that, So they did not find profitable outlets. Why? Because the value chains in the global south were exhausted, where they shifted production, in Asia there, in all of those countries, these things are produced there. Anything you can think of is produced in Asia and in China. So they've shifted there. So they've exhausted that. They would have exhausted that. The new technologies, they bring about innovation in production. They improve communication, and so on and so on. They do many things. They change, in a way, the architecture of society, Others are even talking about a surveillance capitalism that is emerging out of these technologies. Others are saying it's a fourth industrial revolution. So all of those things did not create profitable outlets for capital to invest and grow. So the rates of profits have not been growing since that Great Recession of 2008. Instead, because this is a financialized economy, growth in the equity markets, in the stock exchanges, have been very high, sometimes 12%, 20% even sometimes. But then they know that, like all growth cycles, they come to an end. So they knew. So the stock exchanges actually were the first to suffer the corona crisis. They were destroyed, something like 30% of the value in the equity markets was destroyed in February, March, before the real economy contracted. Tina, up in South Africa, were already in recession, if you remember, as the corona was coming. The other quarter, we recorded a negative GDP. The following quarter, we got another. Now, a clever economist said, no, it's a technical recession. You see in the township, say, recession, whether it's technical or what. So it was a recession. We're in a recession already. And now, the other quarter has come out, I think the first quarter this year. It's a recession as well. Is it 4 or 5%? Figures don't matter, because what is clear is that the slump that is going to come out of corona because of the lockdowns. I mean, firms are closed, workers are at home, production has been halted, no commerce is taking place other than essential things. So the slump is going to be very severe like the 1928 Great Depression, The 2008 Great Recession will look like a picnic. So all figures, and there's almost consensus amongst economists that the contraction that is going to come is going to be very severe. Unemployment as well. In the US already, they are in the 20s. Can you imagine? They always say, no, they have full employment, 5%. Now, they have 22 unemployment in the US. They don't have food. I saw people driving in SUVs to collect food there, in New York. They are getting hungry. Rich people in the wealthiest country in the world. So yeah, they do predict that by the end of the year, the contraction will be negative 14%, even 20%, even more, So it has no solution within the neoliberal framework, the crisis. So that's why even the packages you see, some economists call them stimulus packages. No, these are not stimulus packages. These are emergency packages. Because when you say stimulus, you're talking recovery after the economy. You are stimulating investment, you are stimulating output, you are stimulating employment after. Now, we are still in a crisis and it has not even reached its peak. Now, those who are saying these are stimulus packages, it's like when your house is burning and then you call your architect to say, my house is burning, can you draw me a plan for my next house? No, you don't do that. You go, what was that thing that Zuma did in Kandla there? Where you look for a fire extinguisher. I want the word they use. You look for that thing, You extinguish the fire and you try to save the things, the clothes you can save from the house. So that's what the governments are doing. They're not stimulating the economy. They can't. It's not possible because the economy is locked down, So they'll only start stimulating the economy when the crisis is over. The crisis has not reached its peak, even in the US. But capitalism is so short term. They've released in the US, they are dying. Before I came here, I think they are approaching 100,000 now, the deaths in the US. The case is at 1.5. And yet they are reopening their economy. So these are not stimulus, even in Keynesian terms. Stimulus will come after. I'll come to that. those who started with me, I said, after the Second World War, Keynesians thought they could control the aggregate demand in the economy. Capitalism suffers from the problem of effective demand, as Rosa Luxemburg first pointed out. Now, Keynes and Kalecki then said, no, government must intervene. They were not listened to in the 30s. Keynes wrote that book a long time ago, before the World War, But then the World War created an opportunity, the destruction of the Second World War created an opportunity for his ideas to be implemented, and they were implemented. And on the financial system, the Bretton Woods financial system, he said, no, it's not going to work. And he was vindicated. It didn't work. It collapsed in the 70s. That's when Nikas pulled out the dollar as part of the gold standard. Now, where was I? So I was talking about stimulus. So I was saying, no, these are not the stimulus. They are emergency packages to save companies, to save households against the worst effects of the raging crisis. The crisis is still raging. And we don't know when is it going out, because there's no vaccine that is coming. And I don't know if this thing is true. I've not heard what government says about this new projection, but I heard Cyril saying the worst is still coming when it comes to corona, but yet he still did not sound to be preparing us for anything better. Lastly, on the economy now, the global economy does not have a saver, like in the 2008 crisis, where China was a good saver of capitalism, in that it maintained high growth levels, even though it also slowed down a bit from 10 to 7, 6, but it was still growing very high. So it kept the global economy on a higher average, But now, even China is affected, because China's macroeconomic structure is largely heavily dependent on exports and investments. They have less of domestic consumption, unlike in the West. Now, domestic markets are down. They are very low, or they are closed. So you can't invest, so they'll not invest. So even China, they reported the other day that they contracted. China contracted. Can you believe it? China negative growth. Even unemployment in China now is growing. So no one is going to save capitalism. On the political, the capitalism since the 70s had neoliberalism as a main way of managing societies, where the state is subordinated to capital. And the progressive movements of the post-war, the communists, as led by the USSR and China. China was always independent. It was not part of the Soviet bloc. They were doing their own thing. That's why they are still around. Soviet is not around. So China was part of the communist world. Then you had liberation movements here in Africa and in Asia, And then you had social democrats in Europe, A social democracy came about after the Second World War as a way of averting a socialist revolution in the West. So it was implemented such that you appease workers. They were saying they are giving workers socialism under capitalism, because they expanded the social wage, free education, free health, free housing, guaranteed jobs. So it was a social contract. But then it collapsed from the 70s, coming this way in the 80s. Even wages as a proportion of the GDP or income, national income, in all of those countries of the North, in America and UK, declined. US had a different social democracy. It did not have a lot of social services like Europe, but their workers were highly paid, highly paid. So the economic wage covered for the lack of social wage. But then with the neoliberalism eroding those gains in the 80s and 90s, Obama then had to implement Obamacare, even though Obamacare was not a completely universal health cover. But they still opposed it. But now, they say Maizele Obamacare because Corona has showed them neoliberalism doesn't work. You can't subject health to the market. No. Give people health services. So the political systems, therefore, the trade unions got weak, and then you had in these countries, the main bourgeois parties had a free reign. In the US, you have one party there split into two, Democrats and Republicans. If you don't believe me, there's that black guy. He used to be a Republican. I remember him. He was he was a defense minister under Bush, the young Bush. When Obama came around, he crossed to the Democrats. So, it's one party split into two. So even in Europe, the social democratic parties were, in some instances, communist parties would have affiliated. And so Europe, unlike the US, had more diverse politics in that you had capitalism and socialism contesting there for a while, The Communist Party of Britain was affiliated to the Labour Party, and there were many radical unions there in the Labour Party. So Labour Party was radical, but then in the 70s, they made a pact with neoliberalism. And it became worse under, who's that guy who invaded a country with Saddam Hussein? Under Blair, the third way, it became worse. So even socialist parties of Europe, they sold out. So that was neoliberalism. Even communist parties, the Communist Party of India endorsed neoliberalism itself, So it's that system that is tumbling. Now, the left is weak. So when the left is weak, the right wing takes advantage. So we see the ascendance of right-wing nationalism. Some, they say it's the return of fascism, but not in a cyclical way, in a new way that shows that history moves forward all the time. So that's why you have a Trump presiding over the US. There are videos that are running every day here that say, where Trump says, no, if I choose to go to politics, I will join the Republicans because the Republicans are dumb. But they still elected him. And when they complain about Trump, it's like, no, they elected him. It's their system. Actually, it's not democracy, that thing. And even people who thought that Bernie Sanders stood a chance, they were dreaming. That's why the establishment in the Democratic Party easily mobilized to kick him out. It was not a magic, that thing. It happens all the time. So the social democracy he promises would not happen. The system will not allow it. So that's why even in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn, when he stood a chance of winning, first they said this guy is not winnable. He's a Trotskyite. Jeremy Corbyn is not even a radical Marxist. They say, no, he's a Trotskyite. And then if that didn't stick, they say, no, he's anti-Semitic. No. They say anything. And the whole media was against him. And I think some comrades in Britain, they say the mistake he made was to spend a lot of time responding. And some comrades thought he could have won. I think no. These are captured democracies. They are democratic frauds. Samir Amin, before he died, he wrote a paper to say this thing is a democratic fraud. That's what it has become. We must fight for a new universalist alternative that is democratic, not this thing, And to think that we can form a socialist party, contest elections, we now are joking. So it's that crisis everywhere, the political crisis. But the political crisis as well shows in the fact that institutions that are supposed to govern are very weak. I mean, you can see, what is this body? The World Health Organization is so weak, you know. Trump pulls out money there. When Trump pulls out money, they say, no, we'll not be able to implement some of these programs now to fight corona. So it's a crisis of politics as well. So global institutions are very weak. So in this corona, when we're supposed to have solidarity, and actually in a lot of liberal media, they say, no, we're all in one. This corona affects us the same. No, it doesn't. We're not one. No, the US, they want to do the things their own way. You know, capitalists, they want to emerge as the ruling class after this corona. They don't want to be overthrown. So we're not one. And I'll make remarks about that a bit later. So it's a crisis of politics, even here in South Africa. You know, you don't know who to vote for these days. I mean, the ANC is not coming back, even under Cyril. I mean, even ministers can't stick just to lockdown rules. Ministers, you know, this thing is a disaster. And then the minister says, no, we ban cigarette. I don't support cigarette, but the motivation of saying when there's a zol, and then there'll be saliva, then that saliva will infect people. No, man. Actually, even BB is not called a zol in the township. A zol is a zol, man. We all know a zol. Insang is all, not BB, what she was talking about. So they are so detached from the working class that the things they say, and then that thing is made a caricature. People laugh about it. It's all saliva, you know. So it's clear, this political crisis, that we need a better management that involves communities better, transparency, you know, and the fact that we're dealing with a health crisis here. So it's linked as well with the social, in that the people who get more affected by this corona, even in the US, are the more vulnerable groups, are the more exploited groups, are the more the poor groups, you know, black people, unemployed people, they get affected more. So even in the US, even in Europe, everywhere, migrants, they get affected more. Even here in South Africa, if it hits us more, it's going to hit us more, particularly in the popular classes. So corona shows that capitalism fails to preside over society in a sustainable way, be it the economy, be it ecology, be it politics, be it social reproduction. So what's the way forward? Like I said, capitalism has no way out of this one. Emmanuel Wallerstein, who died last year or this year, this corona thing confuses me. He used to say, capitalists are aware that capitalism is going. There's no way that is coming back out of this big crisis. He was counting 40 years, like 10 years ago. He was saying 40 years, no, this thing will be a goner. But capitalists, they want to emerge as the ruling class in the next social system. And they want that social system to have hierarchy, oppression, exploitation, alienation, all the bad things that capitalism have. And in that system, they must be the ruling class. That's what they want. So that's why every 5-10 years, they create schemes to say, I remember in the 90s, there was globalization. Hey, we're in a global village. I don't know what happened to that thing, because global inequalities, unequal exchange continued. So there was no global village of equal countries of the world. No. No. The state was stripped of its powers. And then we're told about IT. Like, we thought by now every house will be having a computer, will be living nice in a very IT, techno society. So they do that every 5-10 years. There's a big buzzword they produce. Fourth Industrial Revolution. So we get locked up in those useless debates, and they are trying to find their way out of this crisis. So they have no way out. So that's what Wallerstein said. But then Samir Amin makes a different, interesting proposal. He says, no, capitalism is senile, is in a serious crisis. It's not coming back. But it's not going to die just overnight. It's a slow death, you know. And he says, there's a phrase he uses. He says it's revolution or decadence, you know. Now, decadence is a situation of decay. It has happened in world history, in Europe, between the Roman Empire and the feudal Europe. There was no revolution, you know. Instead, there was a long transition of decadence, you know, where the Roman Empire just declined and it was not replaced by anything. And so it was what we call in Xhosa, ovulas buke. In English, it will be a chaotic situation, you know. I mean, there were beasts in Europe, even witches, anything that you can think of. That was a dark period in Europe between the Roman Empire and the triumph of feudal Europe. So he says that was a period of decadence. But it led to a transformation without any conscious action. It happened. And once European feudal societies crystallized, then they were able to preside, you know, over a new order in Europe. So he says, if progressive forces, left forces, don't gather strength to pose a meaningful change to capitalism, to pose a better system where there's some equality, democracy, and real participation of our people, will go through that period of decadence, you know. And it's hard to tell what it will result to. So here in South Africa, the president announced the emergency. Sorry, they are calling me. Can you believe it? He said it's an emergency package, but and he announced that there will be 350 to all people who are not working every month for the next 6 months. He said he will increase child grant, can't remember by how much. So he made some increases on these grants. I think they've been paid even for the elderly. There were increases. But can you? He also said there will be food through what do you call these things? Food supplies. There's a word they use. So he said food will be distributed in the township and in the informal settlement, so that our people can eat. Because a guy who would ordinarily come here in Prela and help the cars to pack there, and you give him 5 rand, another one gives him 2 rand, and then by the end of the day he has some 50 rand, then he can buy some food at home. That guy has nothing during this lockdown. So I thought this money was money that was going to help such poor families. But can you believe it, that money, not a single person has received these 350 rands. And it's an emergency package. It's almost a month now. You know, he reports last week that there are so much applications, 3 million, I can't remember the figure he mentioned. So that's how bad the situation is, you know. So they send soldiers everywhere. In the township, most of the time, there was no lockdown. In the squatter, there was no lockdown. They send soldiers. You see, we don't have enough soldiers to can send to every street. So there's no amount of military action that can help us. You need to mobilize the community. So as part of the way forward, 2 things are needed. It's social support for the poor, because Stats SA says 75% of South Africans live with the threat of poverty. You know, I talk with my comrades in NUMSA. One comrade tell me, no. He says, no, a guy who works here, who earns 10,000, who rents a flat, he wants to go back to work because UIF is way inadequate. You know, when he goes to UIF, he's going to get 4,000. He's going to get 4,000 when he go to UIF. And he's renting a flat. He has some car to drive and he must buy food. So that 4,000 is way, way inadequate. And the landlord will not say it's corona. No. They'll say go out. So workers are saying, no, want to go to work. But then there's a risk. We don't know whether corona is gone or is coming, you know. So, and I think the debate about whether we should reopen or not reopen, it's no longer useful. But what we need is social support to the vulnerable people. They are the majority, you know. Without helping them, I don't know what kind of a society do we want to build after corona. I mean, he says we must build a better society. But he has not paid just 350. He has not paid it. So do you think a guy like that can build? What city did he say he will build? A smart city or a bullet train? He can't pay just 350. And that 350 is inadequate because according to Stats SA, in their, when they analyze poverty, they have food baskets, 3 food baskets, you know, for people who are really, really poor, people who are poor and people who are poor. So 3. It's 450, 550, and 950. So I don't know why 350. Why at least can't he say, no, it's 550 or 450 even. 350 is way too little, you know, according to even. And I don't even know why he did not announce it. Or food parcels, that's the word I wanted, you know. So even he has not even distributed the food parcels that were promised have not been distributed to our people. So, I mean, these people can't distribute food parcels. If they do, they eat the money for food parcels. Sometimes they drive these food parcels. There's a councillor who was found driving with a big baggie of food parcels. You know, I mean, what will happen to that guy? So what is going to save us is a big social support to poor classes, you know, the vulnerable workers, the informal workers, the unemployed in the township, the old mamas who are looking for their families there in the township and in the rural areas. Those people are the majority. That's what is going to save us. But secondly, government has to adopt an attitude that seeks to work with the people. They must not behave like we're in a war. Saddam Hussein or some mad dictator from one country has invaded us. No, it's corona, this thing, you know. And one guy there on TV was saying, no, here in the township, we don't know anyone who has corona. This thing comes from people who go up and down in the airports there. And there's some truth in that, you know. The middle classes or these upper classes, they fly up and down. They go here, Europe, China, Kai. They come back with corona. Then you punish the poor people. So we need to work with communities, you know. Communities are organized. Go to any community, you will see, go to clinics there. You will see on their own, they have organized how to queue, to collect medicine. You know, people for TB this side, people for ARVs this side. Communities are organized, you know, and we must strengthen that organization, you know. So those are the 2 demands from me as we approach level 3. Now, when it comes to these other emergency measures, the basic, this 350, it must be increased to 500. And it must not be cancelled after corona. I mean, if you battle, and because our people are still poor, and so it's not like after corona they'll be well off. No, it must not, because everywhere in the world they are discussing a universal income grant. Now, how come we say, no, this is just for the emergency after Corona and Dr. Bonello, but our rhetoric says we need a new society. It's no longer a rhetoric, this thing, it's just down lies. So, and EFF is correct as well when they say, no, these grants must not be lowered after Corona, you know? Because a Gautrain was built for 60 billion. How many people, I've never been in a Gautrain, how many people use Gautrain? You know, out of all the commuters in South Africa, I'm sure it's less than 1% of commuters. Taxis who transport more than 2/3 of commuters daily. How much did government spend on taxis? The other time, they spent less than 10 billion to recapitalize them, you know. So you spend less than 10 billion for a 2/3 of your commuters. You spend 60 billion, you know. So that's how upset our government policies are sometimes. And they have to change going forward. And the Reserve Bank must change its monetary policy. We must not listen to finance capital. You know, in the West, in America, their debt as we speak is more than 100%. 110 already. Japan, their debt, I'm sure 250, you know, their public debt. But nothing happens to them. All of those countries in Europe, UK, their debt is approaching 100 as well, if not 100 already. But they'll not be downgraded. Our debt here has not reached even 70. They're downgrading us. No, we should not listen to them. We should not listen to them. We should just go on with our thing. So we need a sovereign project. So Corona must help us to gather strength to build a sovereign project. Now, we don't have ventilators. We don't have all of these protective clothing. So instead of placing orders to international companies somewhere in Europe or in China, we should contract companies here to manufacture stuff that we're going to need to fight for Corona, you know. And that manufacturing capacity, post-Corona, we must build a sovereign industrial production system. We will not succeed if we think that somebody one day will come here and invest in our production, employ everybody. So we'll not succeed. So we need to build our own sovereign industrial production system. You know, we need a fiscal policy that is more expansive on social needs. We need a monetary policy that is developmental. So on the way forward, on the economy, those are important things. On ecology, Mantashe the other day wanted to kill us. He was saying, no, there are technologies that can stop coal from producing fossil fuels. What nonsense is that? You know, so we must cut down on fossil fuels because we're going to die. You know, we must implement policies that are environmentally friendly, you know, and if capital disinvest, yes, we must live with that. Because even the IMF earlier this year or last year, they wrote a paper to say, actually, economists don't know what to do with ecology because they can't cost it. You know, economics operate on the basis of cost. So if you say climate change is going to damage, they want to know. These people kidding mau. They want to know how much, and so they want to create a model. And you see, so they have not been responding. But it's not just a technical thing, it's ideological, we know. It's about interests, you know. And so there can be no green capitalism, you know. So we need to build popular movements from this Corona, start building our community organizations, start to work with government, hold them accountable, you know, insist that government implement socially responsive policies on the economy, on environment, on taking care for the needs of the poor, and on better governance system. We must insist on real community participation. You see, Corona is teaching us that if we think one day we'll vote a party that will make our lives okay, we must just dream on. You know, for us to succeed, to build a better society, we need a democracy from below. A democracy from below. So this is a challenge to all of us activists, You know, those who don't have parties like me, you know, who left the Communist Party and the ANC, those who are in the ANC but who are good, those who are in the Communist Party, those who are in the EFF, those who are in the NGOs, those who all the activists, you know, let's work with communities to build a better participatory democracy on the ground where the needs of the people will come first. Otherwise, we'll be complaining on Facebook every day. Amandla. Thank you, Tsele Tsele, and all the comrades.